If you watch this whole video and follow these 7 hacks, it is genuinely possible for you to go from a grade 4 to a grade 9. So the first thing you want to do to go from a 4 to a 9 is to develop a clear focus on the question. Now, what to do for this? There's a fancy thing we call a thesis statement. You might have heard your teacher talk about this, you might not have. But a thesis statement is just a brief outline of your argument or your viewpoint for each paragraph. And this will specifically answer the question. So you'll basically have your own mini point for each paragraph that is different from the other paragraphs, but also links back to the question. So how to do this? You want to use a word from the question and then have like a word or phrase that is your own point that you're going to constantly be referring back to. And in your opening sentence, it should have both your word from the question and your own point very clearly in it. So let's look at an example. So I'm going to pick out my word from the question is responsibility, because that is the question. And my own point, so the thing that I'm going to be really focusing on for each paragraph, and it's going to be my thesis statement, is going to be mouthpiece. So let's look at an example of my whole thesis statement put together. Preeti uses inspector as a mouthpiece to challenge capitalist attitudes and advocate for social responsibility. You can see there, I've got mouthpiece, I've got responsibility. So my thesis statement, it's a 10 out of 10, and I'm going to keep very, very focused in this paragraph. Responsibility, mouthpiece, responsibility, mouthpiece, and link everything back to that. The second thing you want to do is master the use of evidence. Now, what do I mean by this? What to do? You want to use precise quotes. And when I say precise, they are going to be short and specific. Now, so many of you think, oh my gosh, if I learn a really long quote, it's going to show the examiner I've done my revision because I remember this really long quote. That is actually the opposite of what examiners want. They want short quotes that support your point because it shows that you've actually been more selective rather than choosing a really long quote because you're just putting everything in rather than being selective with the information you're choosing. And even as well, not only just short quotes you can use, you can kind of paraphrase moments. So let's look at Macbeth, for example. You could actually kind of talk about the moment of him murdering Duncan, and that also is better than a long quote that you've remembered everything for, because then you can use that specific reference to support your point. So an example, if we're looking at inspector calls, we are members of one body. Short quote, I would embed it into my sentence. So I embed it in, I'm not saying this is shown by the quote, but I'm making it flow within the sentence. The third thing you want to do to easily go from a grade 4 to a grade 9 is to analyze methods, not techniques. I always feel like it's super confusing when people say methods, and it's like, what is a method and how is that different to a technique? So let's break that down. So what to do is you want to just go beyond just naming literary techniques. So you don't want to just name a connotation or a metaphor or a simile. You don't want to just comment on it. You want to analyze how the writer's choices, so their methods, create a meaning and support their ideas. So we want to be thinking through the lens that the writer has intentionally done something, and what does that metaphor, that simile, or whatever the technique is that they've used, how does that make us understand something else that's going on? Does it make us understand the text better? Does it make us understand their point of view better? What is the impact of that writer's method or their choice of that technique? So how you can do this really easily is you can use what, how, why. Now we show you in depth on the Lightup Hub how to use this, how to also pair this with the analytical paragraph structure of Petter, Etter, Cool. And if you don't know about Petter, Etter, Cool and the analytical structure, you're missing out on so many marks, because if you don't know how to properly analyze and structure your paragraphs, it doesn't matter how much you know about the text, you won't fully get there. So what I'll actually do is I'm going to put a link in the description below so you guys can actually download for free our cheat sheets on both literature and language that will help you boost your grade. So let's just go briefly into what, how, why. But like I said, if you want it in depth, just check it out on the Lightup Hub. So what means you just identify the technique. State the technique. Is it sibilance? Is it connotation? Is it a metaphor? Is it a simile? Literally state the technique. How is you want to explain how the writer has used that technique. So thinking about what it shows. And then why, you want to discuss why it is used and the impact on the reader or the audience. So let's look at an example. Our what, so our technique, is going to be dramatic irony. And remember, dramatic irony is we as an audience know something that the character doesn't. And we're going to be looking at the quote, the Titanic is absolutely unsinkable. And also notice as well, I've got the ... is because I've condensed the quote, because like I said in the tip before, we don't want to use really long quotes. We would want to shorten them down if they are longer and use precise references to support our point. So now let's look at my how. Precy uses dramatic irony to highlight Mr. Burling's misplaced confidence and ignorance. By making his grandiose statements that the audience knows to be false, Precy undermines Burling's credibility. And then finally, let's look at our why. So let's look at how it links to the wider things, how it impacts the reader/audience. This emphasizes Burling's arrogance and self-interest, portraying him as a microcosm of capitalist greed and complacency. And remember, a microcosm is when something small represents something larger. The audience, aware of the Titanic's fate, is positioned to align with the inspector's critique of such flawed perspectives, reinforcing Precy's message about the dangers of ignoring social responsibility. So that is a perfect example of what, how, why. And number 4 is to explore context thoughtfully. So what to do? You want to use context to enhance your argument rather than writing a long history essay. Now, so many of you will tend to do this is, again, just like the quotes, you want to show the examiner you've revised. So you're like, right, I'm going to use these long quotes. I'm going to use all of this context, this precise context. But what you end up doing is writing a mini history essay. And unfortunately, this is English. We don't want a history essay. So again, you want to use these precise short references to support your argument. If your context doesn't add to the point you're making, then it shouldn't be there. Because then it just feels bolted on. It just feels like something you're doing just to tick a box. And that actually deducts marks almost from your writing style because it's not cohesive. It doesn't flow together. And grade 9 students, even if you're not aiming for a grade 9, you should still be aspiring for that level, because if you fall a bit short, then you're still gonna get top grade. They make everything flow together, so their context flows within their sentence. That is what you want to do. Let's look at a little example. So in A Christmas Carol, instead of explaining the whole 1834 Poor Law, I would write, as the 1834 Poor Law introduced the grueling workhouses, Scrooge's dehumanising treatment of Bob Cratchit is reflective of the dehumanisation of the poor at the time. So you can see, of course, I've spoken about the 1834 Poor Law, which is context. I've linked it to how it impacts my understanding of the novel. I've linked it to Bob Cratchit and Scrooge's treatment, so there's a link between my context and how it directly impacts the text. And that is what you want to make sure you're focusing on, not over-explaining the context, but actually linking it back to how it contributes to the meaning and how you understand the text differently because of the context at the time. And number 5 is you want to plan and structure effectively. So what you want to do for this is you want to spend 5 minutes planning your essay at the beginning before you write it. So many people are like, planning's a waste of time. Genuinely, planning could be the difference between a grade 4 and a grade 7. It makes that big of a difference. And those students who sleep on planning are those who are literally leaving marks on the table. Because by spending 5 minutes to plan, then you've got 3 really clear ideas, and that links really nicely back to thesis statements, because then you've got clear ideas to link it back to from your own point and the word from the question. And then of course, you also want to use a structured approach. And like I mentioned before, on the Lightup Hub, we go through how to do that. But please stop using things like peel and petal, because it is limiting your grade and it is actually stopping you from being as insightful as you want. Because grade 4 students and grade 9 students, yes, a grade 9 student could use a peel structure, but they'd be doing so much more than just peel to get a grade 9. So by using a bit more of a complex structure or more things within a structure, it'll actually make your writing easier. So here's an example of a little essay plan that I would do for a Christmas Carol. Say for example, the question is, how is regret presented in A Christmas Carol? So paragraph 1, I'm just gonna briefly jot down like what I'm gonna speak about. Talking about how he's the antithesis of regret in stave 1. Antithesis means that he's the opposite. Paragraph 2, I talk about how the ghost of Christmas Yet to Come catalyzes regret in Scrooge. Catalyzes means he like kickstarts, he produces. And then paragraph 3, talking about how Scrooge's regret is transformative. And you'll see my plan very clearly. I've got 3 separate points, and also my 3 separate points all link back to the word from the question. So again, linking our thesis statement, I've got 3 clear ideas. And by planning it, it means I'm not going to repeat my ideas. I've got a clear focus for each paragraph, and I can be laser focused that paragraph 1, I'm just focusing on antithesis of regret, antithesis of regret. And I can keep laser focused, and that is an easy way to get top marks. And number 6 is you want to practice writing about structure. So how you're going to do this and what to do. So you're going to analyze how a text structure, so like the openings, the endings, the narrative development, so how the kind of plot progresses, and think about again how it contributes to the meaning. So just like we did with our what, how, why framework, we want to do this again, but for structure technique. We don't want to neglect structure techniques because everybody speaks about language and most students are more confident with speaking about language than structure, but it's also a higher level skill to be able to comment on structure, but not just comment on structure, is to see how it links to the meaning. So what that shows, what that gives us a better understanding about. So for example, let's look at an inspector calls. A structural element of an inspector calls is that it is a cyclical structure. Cyclical structure means it begins how it ends. It begins with an inspector arriving, it ends with another inspector calling. So we get that kind of cyclical narrative, the inspector coming at the beginning and coming at the end. So what I would do is if I'm commenting on the cyclical structure, is I comment how this links to Precy's understanding and his message of accountability and responsibility. So I would tie the cyclical structure, which is the structure technique, but how it impacts the meaning of what Precy is trying to do. And then the last thing, number 7, is you want to have alternative interpretations. So what to do is very simply, you want to consider multiple interpretations or ideas for a quote. So we don't want to just have one idea that we're arguing. If we've got a quote, we want to give alternative interpretations. So if he says it shows one thing, you could say that perhaps it could show this other thing. So we're weaving in multiple interpretations, multiple different ideas for one quote. So say for example, if we're looking at Macbeth and we're looking at guilt, we might have an argument or alternative interpretations about whether Lady Macbeth's guilt reflects her strengths or her weaknesses. So in one point you could say it shows her strength and then say however, or alternatively, this could show her weakness because. And that just shows you're being critical, which again is a high level skill because you're saying it could show one thing, but also it could show that. So you're considering multiple interpretations. So if you did like this video, guys, please make sure that you subscribe, hit the like button, and what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna put a little video here that is also gonna help you with your GCSE English revision.